All right, let's talk Alabama Crimson Tide with some surprising news that has come out recently. The Tide have lost quite a number of players this offseason in the transfer portal, but they are getting one back. Let's get right into this report and we'll talk about it more on the other side. This is from Tuscaloosa News. Kaden Proctor is set to play a second season for Alabama football after all. In a wild series of events, Proctor told On3 he intends to enter the transfer portal and transfer to Alabama only a few months after the tackle left the Crimson Tide to transfer home to Iowa. So, for those of you who aren't aware, there's obviously now another transfer portal window, and Kaden Proctor is using it to return to the Crimson Tide. This is quite literally a massive addition to the Tide. Mize, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. But first, Alabama fans in the comment section below, on a scale of 1 to 10, and you got to be totally honest here now, how shocked were you to hear Kaden Proctor leaving and then returning, right? I've never seen anything like this happen in the history of college football. Maybe I'm wrong, but I tell you what, I am as stunned as anybody. To me, this would be a 10. But grade, or on a scale of 1 to 10, I should say, give us how surprised you were to hear this news that Kaden Proctor, after making a lot of noise about leaving and going to Iowa, decides to come back to Tuscaloosa. Make sure you put that in the comment section below. But Miles, give me your thoughts on this news and what it means for Alabama football.
Gotta feel bad for Iowa, right? This is the second time this has happened to them from Alabama. Obviously, in the beginning of his career coming out of high school, he was committed to Iowa. Then, at the last second, he flipped and he comes to the Crimson Tide. Nick Saban retires. Then he says, okay, I'm going to go back home. I'm going to go with Iowa. And then Kalen DeBoer is working some of that magic we see. We saw him do it with recruits. Now he's doing it with, transfer portal guys as well. Convinces Proctor, okay, come on back. In the same offseason he left, he was convinced to come back to Alabama as well. I think that is just, like you said, very surprising and very incredible. But I think it's extremely needed for the Tide as well, because going into this season with this offensive line, the way all of these holes have been poked into it, would have been quite the scare for Alabama. J.C. Latham going to the NFL draft, a Proctor going to Iowa. Their two tackles, starting tackles from last year, would have been gone. Getting Proctor back is such a huge move for Alabama, so you don't have to have so many question marks across this offensive line that last year, if we all remember, during the beginning of the season, it was a weak point for Alabama until they really started to get things going. So I think giving Kalen DeBoer as much help as possible, solidifying this offensive line, is really going to help them have the smoothest start possible. So getting a guy that is as good as Kaden Proctor back, he's a very highly touted recruit. He was a great player at Alabama. I think this was huge news for Alabama, and I'm really excited because this finally gives Kaden DeBoer just a little bit of help. He doesn't have to, scramble and do everything on his own. It's a guy coming back that he's able to pull back and say, hey, all right, we have some good news on the offensive line. We're not starting from absolute zero scratch to get plug players in. We got a starting point. Let's build around this. So I'm really excited for Proctor to be back at Alabama because I think he's so necessary on this offensive line.
I agree with everything you said there, but I really think what this really sends is a message to Kalen DeBoer saying, listen, the culture at Alabama, and more importantly, the talent level is so redonkulously high left over from the Nick Saban era, is that when a guy went home to the University of Iowa and spent a few weeks right around his potential future teammates in the weight room, maybe doing some drills on the side. I don't think spring ball had officially started for Iowa. It might have. You may have to fact check me on that, but he certainly hasn't gone through a whole gauntlet of practices or scrimmages or anything like that. He's just done up to this point. He's like, yeah, these guys aren't as good as the Alabama guys. I want to go back to those guys because they're really good, right? That's really what this is, right? We talk about it all the time on this channel. A players want to play with A players. If you're an A player, you don't want to be on a team. No offense, Iowa Hawkeyes, with a lot of B minus C plus players. That's what Iowa is. Now they usually play above their talent, credit to them, but that's really what they are. You look at their roster, it's a lot of B minus C plus. Proctor is, at least on paper, an A talent kind of guy. He wants to play with other A talent. And Alabama, still currently on their roster, is an A talent team. Now, to me, that means Kalen DeBoer you cannot screw this up, right? This is one thing that can happen when a new coach takes over an old regime that has an incredible amount of talent baked in the cake. You get there and you kind of screw it up a little bit. You take a dip in recruiting and you go from an A talent team to a B minus talent team. And then suddenly this Kaden Proctor move just doesn't happen in the future. Now, this is where Kalen DeBoer has some good news on his side, is that Alabama had the second highest ranked recruiting class this past class 2024. So that gives me some positivity that Alabama can still handle elite recruiting at the high level. But like we talked about yesterday, the reality is LSU's making big time moves in the recruiting game in the SEC as well. So this is obviously outstanding news for the Crimson Tide, certainly for the offense going forward, and certainly the short term for Kalen DeBoer. But it also puts a lot of pressure on DeBoer saying, listen, man, you have got to make sure you keep the talent pipeline at Tuscaloosa really, really strong, because that's still your number one draw. You have so many A players that other great players, other great recruits want to play with those guys. Keep that high level of talent, and Alabama will still be successful. But if it dips, watch out, because there are some people up and coming in the SEC.
Yeah, Nick. And speaking of this recruiting class, you have three guys coming into the recruiting class. How good is it to have, like a veteran guy on the offensive line to kind of mentor those guys coming in? If you had a whole group of new guys, like first day of school, everyone's sitting around, no one really knows what's going on. You got to have that one guy there to kind of lead the pack, and that's going to be Proctor. Even though he was just a freshman last year, coming into this year, he's already solidified his seat at the table as the veteran guy on this Alabama offensive line. You guys like Casey Poe, Will Sanders, and Joseph Ionata who are coming into Alabama as recruits, but you also got some guys from Washington coming in as transfers to this Alabama team as well. Parker Brailsford as well on the interior offensive line coming over from there. I think this was big time news for Alabama in more ways than one. It's like you said, you cannot screw this up, but I have full faith and confidence in a coach like Kalen DeBoer. I think he's going to handle this one right, and I think that's why he was able to get Proctor back in the first place.